Have you ever taken a sip of your homebrew and thought, whoa, what is that? Something just doesn't taste right. You start to wonder where it all went wrong. Well, before you go dumping it all out, we're going to figure out what off flavor you have in your brew and how to prevent it from happening again. I'm TheBruSho, and this is TheBruSho. Let's talk off flavors in beer. Off flavors can really ruin your beer and make you question how things could have gone so wrong. You tell yourself you did everything right, but somewhere along the lines your beer took a turn for the worse. Sometimes this can be due to stress yeast, sometimes it's due to improper techniques, and sometimes it just kind of happens without you doing anything wrong. The key to mastering off flavors is being able to identify them and what typically causes them. That way you can backtrack and look at your notes to see if you can pinpoint the area that needs to be fixed for the next brew. But luckily, as you'll see, some of these off flavors can be fixed even after you detect them, so fear not, your beer can still be saved. I'm covering the most common off flavors you might find in a beer, so if I don't cover a weird flavor that's in your beer, let me know in the comments and I can be sure to cover it in another video. Also, you can always reach out to me on Instagram at TheBruSho or post in the Discord server. A link to join is in the description. Number 1. Oxidation. I'll start out with this off flavor because almost every home brewer has probably heard of oxidation. Oxidation is most commonly identified as a wet cardboard, musty, dull flavor. But as hoppy beer brewers know, it also greatly impacts the hop characteristics in the beer. Not only does it dull the hop aroma and flavor, it can turn the beer sickly sweet, like hard candy. It can also impact the color of your beer, making it turn darker or even have a purplish hue, which is more noticeable in hazy beers. Oxidation can happen anytime once fermentation has begun. Oxygen helps support yeast growth at the beginning of fermentation, but after it's in full swing, any additional oxygen exposure can really ruin your brew. That means avoid splashing, sloshing, roughly transferring, or opening your fermenter needlessly. And when packaging, purge your keg with CO2 before transferring it. Luckily for bottlers, you're going to do a second fermentation in the bottle, so when you add priming sugar, the fermentation kicks back up and the yeast will consume any oxygen left in the bottle. But still try to minimize oxygen as much as you can. Unfortunately, once your beer is oxidized, there's no going back. Depending on how badly you oxidize your beer, will reflect on how quickly you see changes in your beer. But there's really no way to fully prevent oxidation. Every beer will eventually oxidize. The goal is to minimize oxygen as much as possible throughout fermentation and packaging. But as long as you're mindful, your beer will last more than long enough for you to enjoy it. Number 2, sulfur. Sulfur is a unique off flavor because for some beer styles, a little sulfur is actually accepted. But when it's too much, it can make it hard to drink. Sulfur is commonly identified by a strong aroma that's reminiscent of rotten eggs, or what I like to call rhino farts. Sounds gross, right? For the most part, it only impacts the aroma of beer, but scent and taste are closely tied, so it can be hard to get past that initial shock of smell. Sulfur can come about a few ways, but most simply, it comes from stress yeast. When the yeast are working hard to convert sugars into alcohol, they can get overwhelmed if they don't have enough nutrients, or there's not enough of them to do all the work. So to combat this, it's always smart to pitch a good amount of healthy yeast by making a yeast starter. I've shown this several times before, but it gets you started on the right foot for healthy fermentation. Check out my videos I've pinned here if you want to see me make a yeast starter in more depth. As I mentioned, in some styles of beer, a little sulfur is acceptable. This is typically true for most lagers. So with that, lagers tend to put out a bit more sulfur compounds than ale yeast. This is especially the case if you ferment lagers at higher temperatures than what is normally suggested. So if you can, try and keep that fermentation temp down. Thankfully, sulfur is one of those off flavors that can actually be cured. Not always, but in some less extreme cases. All you need to do is to give it some time. Leave the beer in the fermenter for a few extra days or weeks until the sulfur smell dies down. During that time, as the yeast wrap up fermentation, they'll do a little cleanup before going to sleep, in the process reducing off flavors. That cleanup time can actually also help with other off flavors, including the next one. Number 3, acetaldehyde. Hard to say and sometimes hard to detect. But when acetaldehyde is present in large amounts, you notice. It can be described as a strong green apple or Granny Smith flavor, or even like cracking open a fresh pig squash. But don't let the idea of green apple confuse you. It doesn't necessarily taste sour like a Granny Smith. It just has that flavor and aroma of an apple that's been left on the counter for a bit too long. This off flavor can be increased for a number of reasons, but we're looking at the usual suspects here: stress yeast, bad sanitation practices, and oxidation during fermentation. But most notably, this can come about when you package or consume beer when it's too young. This can happen with a lot of off flavors, especially sulfur. But if you keg up or bottle your beer while it's still at the tail end of fermentation, it can lock in those off flavors and there's nowhere for them to get off-gassed or cleaned up by the yeast. Fun fact, acetaldehyde is actually the precursor to ethanol, so every fermentation has a bit of it. And the earlier you sniff your beer during fermentation, the more you'll notice it. It's just a matter of giving your beer and the yeast the time to take it back up. So just let it rest in the fermenter until you don't notice it anymore. Number 4, diacetyl. Diacetyl is another fermentation-based off flavor, meaning it's naturally created during fermentation, and just like acetaldehyde, can be reabsorbed by the yeast. But if not, it's one of the more unique off flavors you'll get. It can be identified as buttered popcorn, butterscotch, and even give an oily, slick mouthfeel. In fact, they actually use diacetyl as the compound in microwave popcorn to give it that movie theater smell and taste. I personally hate diacetyl, and I must have a heightened sense to it because it really grosses me out in beer. You'll have to let me know if you feel the same in the comments, or let me know which of these off flavors is your worst nightmare. As mentioned, diacetyl is naturally created during all fermentations, and as fermentation wraps up, the yeast will take it back in to near unnoticeable amounts. You can encourage this near the end of fermentation by doing what's called a diacetyl rest, which is where you raise the temperature of your fermenter 3 to 4 degrees for a few days to speed up the yeast's job of taking back in the off flavor. But diacetyl can also occur when there's a bacterial infection. Lactobacillus is one bacteria known to promote it, so keep your fermenters clean and sanitized. Number 5, dimethyl sulfide, or DMS. Last but definitely not least is DMS, the nightmare for any light beer brewer. DMS is said to be perceived as cooked cabbage, creamed corn, or even a tomato paste ketchup flavor, none of which I really want in my beer, especially a light-bodied lager. To understand where DMS comes from, we first need to look at S-methylmethionine, or SMM, which is the precursor to DMS. SMM is produced during the germination of grains, and then is converted to DMS during the boiling on brew day. It's most notably found in 6-row, Pilsner malts, and some adjuncts like corn. So you can already guess that light lagers can be tough. Thankfully, the best way to remove DMS is pretty simple. Just have a vigorous boil. The experts say at least 60 minutes. But if you're like me, I rarely boil longer than 30 minutes, and I have yet to have any DMS in my beers that I know of. Even in my American Light Lager, which had Pilsner, flaked corn, and was boiled for 30 minutes, it still came out clean and delicious. I think this is mostly thanks to the highly modified malts that we have at our access today. Malting has come a long way over the last few decades, so I personally think this is not one you need to worry about too much. But if you do notice that ketchupy flavor in your beer, it might be a good idea to boil a little longer or have a more intense rolling boil next time. When you take a step back and look at all these off flavors, a lot of the time it comes down to the basic brewing skills every brewer should know. Practice good sanitation, pitch a lot of healthy, strong yeast, control fermentation temp, avoid oxidation, and give it some time. These key steps will help you be on your way to better tasting beer. But if you're new to brewing with limited equipment, it can be kind of hard to do all that. So picking the right style for your situation can go a long way. Pick yeast that can handle higher temps, promote less noticeable off flavors, and try a malt bill that can hide some of the flaws. Dark, complex beers can be great starter beers for that very reason. I hope you're able to pick up some good tips from this video to help you brew better beer. And if you did, be sure to hit the like button and consider subscribing for more homebrewing tips and tutorials like this. Happy brewing, and cheers!